I want to talk to you today about teachers' work practices. We've heard a number of times today about the importance of practice and the importance of teachers' practice changing as you adopt new methods of curriculum, new standards, new approaches. And what I've done, and what I'll present to you, is a comparison of teachers' work practices between teachers of science in Kazakhstan schools, all types of schools, and teachers of science in the United Kingdom. And I'll just briefly walk you through the framework that we've used for the analysis and show you just a few selected results. And that one. So you've heard a number of references today to Dewey and Stenhouse and many others talking about practice. And what we've done as a group, I've been working in Kazakhstan on and off for the last 5 years, observing teachers, talking with teachers, going to pedagogical institutes, pedagogical universities, and visiting NIS schools. And we've been observing how practice is changing or not changing. And the reason for looking at practice is that it can inform the implementation of curriculum and identify areas where you might need to offer some greater support. And when we talk about practice, we're not just talking about the act of instruction. We're talking about the broad sweep of professional acts, everything from lesson planning to the collegial exchanges, to the design of lessons, to reflection, to lesson planning and assessment. And as we've observed a number of times today, when teachers' practice changes, that changes how they use their time. And so I've mentioned to you we're comparing Kazakhstan and England, partly because the new curriculum comes from Cambridge International Exams. It is, while it is international in its approach and its perspective, it's informed in large measure by norms of English practice or aspirational norms of English practice. And we used TIMSS data, which is the Trends in International Mathematics and Science or something like that. I can never remember what TIMSS actually stands for. But the TIMSS data is well regarded, it's available, it's relatively easy to use. You can pull it up on the internet. We focused on mathematics because mathematics, to some people's minds, is neutral. It doesn't have a great deal of cultural interpretation and difference across cultural contexts. I think that's a debatable proposition, but there is some truth to it. And we chose grade 8 because that's one of the assessment points in TIMSS, and it's also the point where internationally there is, after grade 8, the structure and nature of secondary schools gets very different and it makes comparisons a little more difficult. And of course there are some very fundamental differences between the teachers in England and in Kazakhstan. And one of those is, as David alluded to, there's a fundamentally different way in the compensation of teachers. English teachers are paid for the whole act of teaching rather than for a staff come. And we think there are very different professional communities, and that difference will be illustrated when we start to look at some data about how teachers use their time. And as well as looking at the data in the TIMSS database, we've talked about, we've informed our observations by our field visits of the last 5 years. And we've used an old framework to organise some of the data, planning to teach, teaching, the actual act of teaching, and post-teaching activities. And from our analysis, we've concluded that there are, in fact, very different norms of professional practice between the mathematics teachers in the two countries. And our primary conclusion is that within their discipline group, Kazakhstan mathematics teachers are far more collegial than English teachers of mathematics. And let me illustrate that a little further. One of the things in the TIMS database is, I've lost it. Sorry, this one doesn't have the heading. How many times does written tests or quizzes used in classrooms, in lessons? And you'll see that they're used much more often in Kazakhstan than they are in England. I actually checked the English figures 3 times, disbelieving them, and I'm still doubtful, but it's a reliable database. How often do mathematics teachers in the two systems ask their students to memorise formulas? This did not surprise me. It's 3 times more common in a Kazakh classroom. But then we looked at what we call the centrality of homework, and here you have 4 different measures about homework in the two systems. And you'll see that homework is much more central to the mathematics classes of Kazakhstan. And it's much more central, and when you discuss the role of homework with Kazakh teachers of mathematics, and when you read the literature about mathematics in Soviet classrooms dating back to studies going back into the 1970s, homework is one of the central organising features of a lesson in mathematics, where homework is reviewed, it is regularly assessed, regularly discussed, it is set, and it's used to capture and extend the concepts and knowledge that the teacher is trying to impart. But you'll also see that it also tends to be much more intense in terms of time demands on students in Kazakhstan. But these are what we call loosely the collegiality measures. And you'll see that if you add the first 2 rows, 89% of English mathematics teachers in grade 8 seldom visited a colleague's classroom. Whereas for the Kazakh teachers, it's much more common. And they have much more dialogue and discussion. So there's a lot more debate and engagement and exchange between Kazakh teachers of mathematics than there are in mathematics teachers in England. And if we read the literature about subject departments, we see that they operate very much as distinct subcultures. And when we talk with mathematics teachers in Kazakhstan, they call themselves mathematics teachers. Their commitment and identification is with the field of mathematics. It's the same with physics teachers. When you have conversations with English teachers of mathematics, they call themselves teachers of mathematics. They see themselves as teachers first, rather than as specialists in the discipline of mathematics. And so when we think about what this might do when you're looking at implementing curriculum reform and change and trying to introduce a large new strategy for the teaching to new standards, there's an opportunity to use this strong identification with the discipline and the strong subject departments and the strong collegiality between the disciplines to target your professional development, to target the way in which you design and deliver new materials, new resources, and specialist coaching and counselling. So you can use this strong subject identification to accelerate what we call the development of communities of practice. But you should also acknowledge that strong subject departments can also be impediments to reform. And that is particularly important to acknowledge and think through when the goals of reform are interdisciplinary or are school-wide, to introduce a new pastoral care system which was interested in the development of the whole child, or in the particular case of Kazakhstan, where you were trying to introduce a trilingual strategy which requires close cooperation between language teachers and teachers of content. So the strength of the collegiality of the Kazakh school system is an opportunity for facilitating the introduction of the discipline-based reforms, but it may be problematic for some of the school-wide reforms. This last little slide refers more to my occasional work in national and international comparisons. About 30 years ago, two leading scholars of comparative studies predicted a rapid growth of multinational comparisons like PISA and TIMSS, and a reduction in the study of bilateral comparisons. And while that is partly true in the sense that there has been a much deeper body of scholarship has emerged over multinational comparisons, bilateral comparisons have also persisted. And Iveta, this is an acknowledgement of your travelling policies. Some of the people who've been arguing about the multinational comparisons say that they're possible because there's greater homogenisation of school systems, that they're closer in policy settings and frameworks. And my response to that is very much some shared by colleagues, that yes, policies have travelled in a sense. They've been copied and pasted of policy words, but the reality, the practice in classrooms is much different. And we look for, what happens is that teachers, professionals, practitioners and school leaders look at policies even when they've been disseminated and promulgated, and interpret them through the lens of their own practice, through their own professional preparation, through their dialogue with their colleagues, and they adapt it, hybridise it, or acclimatise it to the local environment. And these, I argue, are professional, purposeful, informed choices. And you can study those and see them much more readily on a bilateral basis, comparing two countries like Kazakhstan and England. And that was essentially the purpose of this brief study. Successful implementation of reform can be informed by these comparisons, and I encourage those of you who are scholars of these things to do further work in the area. And like David, I acknowledge that I've drawn some of these field observations from our work with the roadmap group, but most of all it's been informed by 5 years worth of dialogue with my colleagues in NIS, schools and the central organisation. And I thank you very much for your attention.